Chapter 13. A Good Fit. I long, as does every human being, to be at home wherever I find myself. Maya Angelou. Chris pulled the weeds from the raised beds of the kitchen garden and threw them towards the enclosure where the chickens clucked and jockeyed for position. They angled for the larger bits, pecked and squabbled over the choicer pieces. It reminded him painfully of home. Jess had done this for Mom in the family garden back in Belton. They might have had a smaller plot of land, not a full-fledged farm with a pond and fields, but chickens are pretty much the same wherever you go. He closed his eyes, remembered her voice as she talked to the chickens, her wavy blonde hair tied back in a ponytail, and the chickens clucked back at her, bobbing their heads in time as she spoke. What she would say to them, he didn't know, but the sound of her voice and the memory of it now was bittersweet. The sun was barely up, the house behind him was quiet, and he savored this moment of solitude. It would be another scorcher today. Already the air was uncomfortably hot and humid. His ankle still ached, but it had been set straight, and he hoped it would heal completely given time. He had come down the back stairs too quickly, and it had twinged a painful warning until he slowed down. He didn't have far to go. The raised beds were, after all, right off of the kitchen. Here the curled leaves of lettuce sprang in a dramatic show of greens and reds. The pole beans and green beans were growing well, and there was room for more in a half-used bed. The soil was rich and loose, well composted. He thought of his mother, Julie, digging her hands deep into the soil. She would smile and dig, weed, plant, and talk about the gardens for hours. How she had loved her gardens. The memory of her smiling face hurt him deep inside. He imagined his parents' last moments, as they tried desperately to stop the enemy soldiers from abandoning a group of small children on the road so many miles from home. It was just like her to speak up, to try and stop such a thing from happening, and for Dad to stand beside her no matter the personal cost. He had wrung the details out of Alan. It had been hard to hear, harder still, though, to not know. His friend had looked haunted as he had recounted the Aronsons' end, as if he thought Chris would hold him responsible somehow or blame him for not interceding. If only he wouldn't have taken that hike and gotten caught up in the first wave, he would have been with them when it all came down. Chris didn't blame Alan, not at all. Instead, he blamed himself. He hadn't been there when they needed him most. And they had died there, miles from home, alone. They had deserved better than that. He sat on the edge of a raised planter and looked over the greenery. Everywhere there was green and life growing. The beans snaked their way up the poles, and the peas were fat and heavy, ready for picking. Plump red strawberries hid under leaves, and he picked a few and ate them. They were warm and juicy, the sweet tang bursting on his tongue when he bit into them. The plants were growing fast, but he would need to water today. He'd do that, and ask the old man if there was any more of the bean and squash seeds left to plant, since there was still time to get them in and growing. As he shifted, his ankle twinged again. He still favored it, but it was getting stronger by the day, and his limp was barely noticeable. He nearly jumped out of his skin when Carrie's voice sounded at his ear. It would be a long time before he would be able to react normally. He was still in combat mode, ready to run or fight at the drop of a hat. She patted his shoulder and smiled. "How's your ankle today?" The wonderful scent of her, this combination of sage and wood smoke, washed over him. It's fine. Damn, but you scared the hell out of me." "I'm sorry." Her emerald green eyes stared into his, twinkling in amusement. "I didn't mean to." She was close, way too close, and Fenton would damn near kill him if he so much as touched her. Of that he was sure. Carrie laid her hand on his cheek. Chris was handsome, there was no denying it. Carrie stared at his deep blue eyes. The only imperfections were the scar on his forehead and a slightly bent nose. Both of the wounds had come from those soldiers. In a way, it made him more handsome to her eyes. He had a way of looking at her that made her want to get closer. She was used to guys taking the lead with her. She'd done her share of making out, but nothing more. Going all the way was supposed to mean something, and she figured she knew who that guy was. Chris seemed to really like her, but he still pulled away, and she didn't know quite how to handle it. It sometimes seemed that he was avoiding being alone with her. Chris had to stop this. Carrie was only 16, and Fenton was protective of both girls. The old man was very, very protective. The two of them had been dancing around each other for weeks. She flirted with him constantly, and he struggled with keeping the image of Fenton and his shotgun in the forefront of his memory. The old man wasn't going to cotton to Chris cozying up to his precious granddaughter. There were limits to a man's hospitality, after all. He shook his head at her and gently removed her hand from his cheek. Carrie looked hurt and a little put out, but then she smiled and took hold of his hand, pulling him to his feet. "Come on, I want to show you something. If you think you could handle a little bit of a hike." His ankle twinged again in protest at the thought of going anywhere. And worse, he wasn't sure he should be alone with her. It was getting harder and harder to resist the impulse to kiss her. Against his better judgment, he let her pull him along. They walked out past the perimeter of the property, into the trees, which quickly became thick woods. The going was difficult, and several times they stopped so that he could rest a moment. The heat of the morning was radically altered underneath the leafy canopy of trees, and there was a cool breeze. "It's just a little further." Carrie pulled him up and they walked again, slowly edging their way down an embankment and crossing a lively creek. He could see tiny fish darting between the rocks, and several dragonflies buzzed by with iridescent green and blue-hued wings. They crossed the creek, squeezed through a stand of trees, and stopped in a small clearing. Wildflowers bloomed everywhere, and he could see a chimney and the remains, mostly intact, of a small stone house. The roof sagged, and it looked as if it had been deserted for a long time. The clearing was a paradise of flowers, birds chirping, and the gurgle of the creek behind them. Carrie smiled at Chris and stepped closer. "Do you like what you see?" The scenery melted away, and all Chris could see were beautiful eyes and perfect skin and soft lips. He slipped his hand behind her head, ran his hands through her hair, and kissed her softly. The kiss went on, intensifying as her mouth opened to him and their tongues entwined. She pressed herself against him, and his other hands slid slowly down her back, finding her shapely buttocks and pulling her up closer. His breathing had quickened, and in his mind a war was being fought. Part of him wanted to stop this, because he was sure Fenton would come around the corner at any minute with the shotgun and shoot him dead for touching his precious granddaughter. The other part of him wanted to pull her to the ground, slip off her tight, sexy jeans, and drive into her. A few long, hot moments later, and they had ended up on the ground. Her shirt unbuttoned, and a white lacy bra covered her perky young breasts. He took a deep breath and sat up. Carrie looked hurt. "What's wrong?" "Besides the fact that you are beautiful and sexy and I want to do far more than just kiss you," Chris smiled. "I'm thinking that Fenton has got one damned scary shotgun." Carrie's eyes lit up at hearing beautiful and sexy, and looked disappointed at the mention of her grandfather. "Gramps is just being protective. Since our parents died, he's taken care of us. He doesn't think of me as a woman." "You're not a woman, you're only 16, Chris reminded her gently. "And I'm nearly 20. "I'll be 17 in less than a month, and you're 19, not 20, she retorted, bristling at his comment. "I know my mind, and I'm not some silly little girl." No, you're not." He kissed her again, long and slow. It was full of promise of things to come. "But I cannot have sex with you, Carrie. Not now. I like you. I like you a lot, damn it. I like your whole family, for that matter. I don't want to piss off Fenton, and I don't want to rush things with you." He took her hand, looked down at the ground. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I want to stay here with all of you Perdues." Her eyes sparkled at the next words. "And I'm thinking that I've never met anyone I thought smelled as wonderful as you, or who is as smart and funny and beautiful as you. I think that here is a good fit for me. I can help with the stuff Fenton is getting too old to do. We could make this farm work and not just survive, but be okay here. Better than okay. But if I stay, then I gotta do this right between you and me. I gotta do it like Fenton expects me to, and damn well court you, and not have sex the first time we go off alone together." She laughed at that, and she knew he was right, even if she didn't like it. "You really want to stay?" "Yeah, I really do." "Okay." They returned to the house with a load of blueberries. The abandoned stone house was the original homestead on the property. The blueberry bushes were bountiful there, and had grown wild after they had been left behind. They wrapped the blueberries in Chris's shirt, since they didn't have a basket. When they returned, Fenton was sitting in a chair on the wide front porch, thoroughly cleaning his shotgun. He looked pissed. Carrie started to say something to her grandfather, but Chris handed her the shirt full of blueberries and gave her a small shove towards the house. He limped over to Fenton and sat down, very aware of his own bare chest and the set look on the old man's face. "Mr. Perdue," the old man harumphed and said nothing. "My ankle is healing, and if you want, I can be on my way in a few more days, with my thanks for your help and hospitality." Chris took a deep breath. "But I'd like to stay, sir. I think I could be of use here. For one, I could get some of those blueberry bushes dug up and transplanted closer to the house. I know how to take care of chickens, raise vegetables, and I can learn the rest. I've helped my dad with roofing and construction, and once my ankle is healed, I could fix the leak in the barn. If you'd want to keep me on, that is." There was a long silence as the old man digested the offer and oiled the barrel of the shotgun. "I ain't blind, you know. I seen you two looking at each other. What you planning on doing about that?" The shotgun was currently in pieces. Chris figured he was relatively safe. "Sir, I'd like permission to court your granddaughter." If he could have read Fenton Perdue's mind at the moment, he would have known instantly that his words and his attitude were perfect. Fenton was old-fashioned. He'd been raised by his grandparents after his father died in the war and his mother died in childbirth. His grandfather had instilled in him a sense of honor and chivalry that was long dead in the modern world. The old man loved his grandchildren more than life itself. When their father had died in the Amtrak bombings just months before Joseph was born, Fenton had insisted the kids and their mother Amy move back to the family farm. She had been a tiny wisp of a woman who had given birth to Joseph 3 months to the day after they buried her husband. Just a few months later, Fenton had insisted she see a doctor. She had been losing weight and was listless and slept round the clock. They'd had to put baby Joseph on formula because Amy just didn't have enough milk to sustain him. The doctor gave her a battery of tests, looked grim, and sent her to a specialist in Nashville. She was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. She had died less than 3 months later. It had been just Fenton and the children ever since. He stopped polishing the shotgun and looked over at Chris, met his eyes, searched them for deceit. He thought about how happy Carrie had looked in the last few weeks and how gentle Chris was with Joseph. Even Liza seemed to appreciate his company, especially when she had discovered that they shared a love for science fiction. Chris had done a lot of reading those first 2 weeks while his ankle healed. There was no denying it. The boy was a good fit for their family. Young love, I wonder if it will actually take. He thought about Molly, who had passed away over 30 years ago now. They'd met at a square dance when she was 15 and he was 18 going on 19. Her daddy had been a doctor and her mama a nurse in the war. They wanted something more for their daughter than a life as a farmer's wife, but as the years had passed, they had seen how much the two were in love. Fenton had ended up being drafted and sent off to Vietnam as a medic. Thousands of miles from home, he had watched men bleed out, spending the last moments of their lives in alien jungles so far from their homes, so many lives lost, so many dreams dead with them, before he had returned home to his grandparents' farm, safe. After 3 years of courting, he had asked Molly's daddy for his blessing, and the man had given it. They had married, built this enormous house after his grandparents died, and began practicing at making babies. Oh, how they had practiced. Both of them were only children, and they wanted a big family. They dreamed of a passel of kids to fill the house's 5 large bedrooms and tumble through the gardens. Fenton looked out over the land. It had been in his family for more than a century, and for the last 5 years he had wondered who would take it on next. Joseph? Carrie? Liza? Who would stay and work this land? The dreams he and Molly had had of a passel of little Perdues died the day of Isaac's birth. The birthing had been hard, and the doctor said if they hadn't have taken everything out, she would have bled to death. So they loved their son, and loved each other for the rest of their time together. That time hadn't been nearly as long as Fenton would have liked. Molly had gotten breast cancer during Isaac's freshman year in high school and passed away less than a year later. He looked at Chris and realized the boy had been sitting there patiently waiting for an answer.
Yes, son. You can court my granddaughter, and heal up quick, 'cause I think the southwest corner of the house roof is needing some repairs.
Thank you, sir.
Gramps.
Sir?
You can call me Gramps, everyone else does.
Right. Gramps. Fenton closed his eyes and listened as Chris got up slowly and limped inside the house. He heard the boy whispered to Carrie. She let out a happy squeal and gave him a loud kiss. Fenton smiled sadly.
I miss you, Molly.